So I'm delighted to introduce Baroness Brown of Cambridge, Julia, who's chair of our Adaptation Committee and also deputy chair of the Mitigation Committee at the CCC. Julia is an engineer and a crossbench peer. She's a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and a fellow of the Royal Society, and was awarded the DBE for services to higher education and technology. So I'm delighted to pass over to Julia to kick us off with a few introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk to this very important conference. So I'm going to have that awful bit now where I try and share my screen. And you get to see all my untidy emails and things. Right. Oh, look, that's worked. Great. So I just want to really pick up what Catherine has started to say, which is to make a few remarks about how I see adaptation in the UK and what we need to do to get that increased focus that Catherine was talking about. We saw a version of this slide yesterday, but to me what this says is that everybody recognizes that climate change is, the most important thing we need to think about, and we need to be doing something about it. So this is from the World Economic Forum. So this is the global leaders of industry and politics all saying that the biggest risks, highest impact, highest likelihood are associated with climate change. So you'd think we'd be all over doing things about it. And of course, Catherine has highlighted this. We are all very committed, I think, that we would like to see the Paris Agreement goal of keeping temperatures to close to 1.5 degrees, but we're already at 1.1 degrees. We have policies and pledges that suggest we could end up between 2.1 and 3.9 degrees warmer by the end of the century. So we're all worried about climate change. We're not yet putting in place the really tough policies that will keep us down to the close to 1.5 degree target. And we really do need to do more, both to reduce emissions and to adapt. And in the UK, we have what should be an excellent framework for that. We have the Climate Change Act, which has now been with us for 12 years. And it sets up processes for reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. And it sets up 2 committees in order to advise the government and scrutinize progress. But the very big difference between how it treats mitigation and how it treats adaptation is that mitigation, it sets a target. And initially it set that target of an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050, and we've now changed that in law to make that 100% by and that happened last year when the net zero target was agreed by Parliament. And that actually makes a big difference between how mitigation progress reporting works and how adaptation reporting works. So mitigation, we have 5 yearly carbon budgets which are put into legislation, and then the government has to provide policies to deliver these, and the Mitigation Committee scrutinizes progress every year. On adaptation, there's the 5 yearly climate change risk assessment, which the government presents to Parliament every 5 years. And as many of you are involved in the evidence, working on the evidence base for that, which we're coordinating on the Adaptation Committee, lots of hard work going on, I know, and thank you to everybody who is working on that. So that our evidence base will be published for that next year, and the new climate change risk assessment the government will present to Parliament in 2022. And then there's a national adaptation programme that the government develops to address the risks. But for the most part, none of this has any specific targets in it. So it is much more difficult to assess progress on adaptation. And in our last report in 2019 on how we were doing on preparing for climate change, the picture was not very positive. So given the lack of specific targets, what we look at across a huge number of sectors of the economy and of the natural environment, we look at whether there are any indicators of progress being made and whether the sectors have plans that take into account the fact that we need to be planning for 2 degrees and we need to be looking at the risks of temperature rises up to 4 degrees. And this is in 2019 where we assessed all these sectors as falling, and sadly many of them still in the red, saying low quality plans, no signs of or little sign of progress. And very disappointingly, that more progress column completely empty. So even where we have sectors like water and energy, where they do and flooding, the Environment Agency's plans where they do have plans that look at 2 degrees and 4 degrees, not yet really good evidence that the kind of progress we need is being made. So we all know this is a problem, but progress isn't happening anything like as effectively or as fast as we need it to. And why is that? Well, certainly adaptation isn't the political priority that mitigation is. Despite the fact it's one of the key themes, adaptation and resilience is one of the key themes for the COP, adaptation is not something you hear ministers and parliament talking about. Lots of talk about net zero. It's under-resourced compared to mitigation. A very small team in DEFRA, a very small team in the CCC compared to the teams who work on mitigation. So some very good work being done by those teams, but not very many people trying to do a very big job. I think a general public perception that actually we've got this net zero target, if we're on track for net zero, then that solves the problem. Not a lack of recognition that we might be on track for net zero, but actually it's the global picture that defines the climate and therefore the weather and therefore what it is we need to adapt to. So I think unfortunately net zero has almost taken away the focus from adaptation. And we've had groups like Extinction Rebellion who worry that by us saying we can adapt to this, we're suggesting that we don't need to reduce emissions. And of course, that's not what we're doing. We're saying, actually, even if we get to net zero, there's still quite a lot of change that we've got to adapt to. And of course, there's still that risk that we don't globally get to net zero. So we do need to prepare for a range of futures, even though we sympathize with Extinction Rebellion's cause, which is that we need to get to net zero as quickly as possible. Adaptation is hard to communicate. There isn't a single vision, a single target, a single metric. We can't just say we've got to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the global atmosphere. It's hard to visualize. We don't have great examples that demonstrate successful adaptation that we can readily show people. We need to be getting more and more of those. Of course, adaptation is a doing thing. It's a process. It's not an end goal, and it's something that we need to go on doing, and we will need to go on doing even when we've succeeded in reducing the emissions. Because of the uncertainty and as Catherine said, the messiness, people find that hard to deal with. And I think if you've just had a 1 in 200 year flood, you think, oh, well, that's fine. It's 200 years before the next one happens. And we're not very good at getting the message across that isn't the right assumption to make. And of course, it's something that has a long-term impact, but the costs are now and upfront. And if one small good thing comes out of this terrible experience the world is having at the moment with the COVID pandemic, perhaps it will be that we need to be much more focused on planning for these scientifically predicted but uncertain future events. Some people do have a good vision, and it's not surprising, of course, that the Dutch given their location and their propensity to flooding, do this well. And so here's a brilliant piece of visioning, I think, the Delta plan from the Netherlands, with very positive plans for both neighborhood flood prevention and regional scale flood prevention. So this is the kind of thing that we need a lot more of in the UK. You know, telling people what their resilient and climate proof community will look like, and emphasizing the need for collaboration between people, business, government, all of the sectors, all of the levels of government. And then also emphasizing the positive benefits, like the additional green space that something like this will generate. So this is the kind of vision I think we need to be doing much more work on in the UK. We need to be getting the message across that adaptation makes a difference. And this is one of my favorite slides from the last evidence base for the last climate change risk assessment. This is a slide that says to me, look, adaptation works. This is what in a high population and high climate scenario, so if we're on that 4-degree track, this is what water shortage could look like in the UK in the 2050s if we don't take more action. But if we do all those sensible things like reducing per capita water consumption down from the current level of about 140 down to closer to 90 litres per person today, if industry makes the right kind of reductions, if we deal with the leakage problems, then actually we could make a huge difference, and we could be in a position in the 2050s, even in that worst case scenario, where most people have plenty of water and we can deal with the small areas where there is a bit of a shortage. We also need to be communicating more about the risk, and it's been great to hear presentations yesterday talking about that. So here's without additional adaptation. This is about the number of people living at significant risk of flooding. And by the 2050s, even if we're on that 2-degree, 1.5 to 2-degree path, the number of people who could be at risk of flooding, if we don't take those measures at household, at river catchment, at coastal level, this number of people could almost double. And of course, much worse if we're on a 4-degree path and as we move further into the century. And then, of course, we do have to have a message to people about we can't adapt for everything. I think people do need to recognize that there is a limit to adaptation, and that sometimes it becomes disaster recovery, and we've got to make sure we're good at that too. And of course, other countries in other parts of the globe know that much better than we do. But here's the example of 2 meters of sea level rise and a 1 in 200 year tidal surge. And essentially, all of England's coastal defences are at risk, and some significant areas are inundated with water. That's not something we can necessarily adapt to. That's something we have to be able to respond to. And people need to understand that risk as well. So adaptation is, I think, the Cinderella of climate change. And I think our job is to see how do we get Cinders to the ball. And what do we need? We need a vision for what the UK that is on that path to adapting looks like. It needs some measurable targets in it, and it needs support at the very highest level of government. But that won't be enough. We need everybody to be thinking about it. We need people to be thinking about what are acceptable levels of risk. Where are the limits to adaptation? Where do we have recognized that actually these are some events that could happen, that actually it will be a disaster response scenario? We need some introduction of standards for resilience, so people know what to expect. Something that the National Infrastructure Commission and the Environment Agency and ourselves have all been calling for, because I think the public and business do need to understand what to expect from resilience and from, for example, the actions that the environment and investments the Environment Agency can make. We absolutely, I think, as the chart I showed you earlier shows, we need better planning. And we need to get away from the idea that there is a risk of 2 degrees of warming. There isn't a risk of 2 degrees of warming. There's a risk that it might be worse than that. So everybody's planning assumption should be that we're on that 2-degree path. That is what we hope the future will look like. But your risk register needs to have the 3 degrees, and I'm afraid it needs to have the 4 degrees on it. So good planning, in our view, is that 2 degrees is your baseline, and 4 degrees, or 3 to 4 degrees, is what is on your risk register. We also need more focus on what the indicators of change are. How can we tell whether things are getting worse or better? That is so crucial for communicating and assessing where we are in terms of essentially in terms of the state of resilience that we are in. So we know what it is we need to do. We know Cinders needs the shoes and the dress. How do we get her to the ball? So how do we do all of this is the challenge. And I know that's what people have been talking about. And Catherine said, it's been great that everybody here wants very much to be part of this. I would like to see us launch, personally, a race for resilience. We have a race for zero that's been launched in association with the COP, where we're getting businesses and organizations and community groups and local authorities all signing up to say they're going to get to net zero. I would like to see businesses and local authorities and community groups all signing up to say that we're going to be prepared for the changes that the climate is going to bring. We're going to be prepared to make sure we live in a successful and resilient country, and that we contribute to making the rest of the globe a successful and resilient world. So I would really like to see a very strong push for a race for resilience, given the same profile as the race for zero as we come up to the COP. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a really great day. I'm sure you will, having seen some of yesterday's proceedings, and I really look forward to hearing about the outcome of the conference overall. Thank you very much.